good evening, and welcome back. I do hope you enjoyed last night's tale. Good. Well, come then. The fire is stoked again, and outside, another storm is moving in. So, settle in close and drift with me tonight. Not along the highways this time, nor the quiet suburbs, but into the very heart of New York City, Times Square, 1979. Neon lights burned above in restless colors, flashing promises of pleasure and escape. But beneath the glow, the shadows were thick, and in those shadows moved a predator. His name was Richard Cottingham. To some, he became known as the Torso Killer. His victims were not only murdered, they were mutilated, discarded, their lives claimed with cruelty so brutal it left New York and New Jersey haunted for decades. And even now, Cottingham's voice echoes from prison walls, confessing to murders stretching back to the 1960s, as many as 100 in all. So come. The storm gathers, the fire crackles low, and together we'll step into the seedy streets of Times Square, where Richard Cottingham's reign of horror began. Tonight, we step into the world of a man who earned the name the Torso Killer. A name whispered in the smoke-filled streets of Times Square, where neon lights burned bright and the darkness between them burned brighter still. But Cottingham was not, at first glance, a monster lurking in the shadows. He was a man who wore the mask of the ordinary, a mask convincing enough to fool even those closest to him. Born on November 25, 1946, in the Bronx, Richard grew up in northern New Jersey. His childhood wasn't marked by violence or chaos, but by the steady rhythms of suburban life. His family was middle class, respectable. He attended school, played sports, blended in. He was not the archetypal loner, nor the outcast. To neighbors, the Cottinghams seemed like any other family. In adulthood, Richard built a life that appeared, at least on the surface, steady and respectable. He trained as a computer operator and secured a position at Blue Cross Blue Shield in Manhattan, a career that carried him through the heart of the 1970s. It was a respectable job in a growing field. He married, fathered 3 children, lived in a comfortable home in New Jersey. To friends and colleagues, he seemed stable, responsible, even ordinary. But behind the closed doors of his mind, a storm brewed. From an early age, Cottingham was fascinated by control, by bondage, domination, the stripping away of another's will. His interest grew darker over time. He collected pornography focused on violence, on restraint, on suffering. He prowled the streets of Manhattan, where the sex industry of Times Square offered endless opportunity. Beneath the glow of movie marquees and the buzz of neon, the underworld thrived. Brothels, massage parlors, streetwalkers, all of it a hunting ground for a man like Cottingham. And while his wife and children slept at home, while his colleagues assumed he was just another commuter on the train, Richard slipped away into this hidden world. There, he discovered his true self. His victims were often vulnerable women, sex workers, runaways, young women on the edges of society. He offered them money or rides, or sometimes nothing at all but force. Once inside his grasp, the facade of the suburban father dissolved, and the predator emerged. Cottingham bound his victims. He handcuffed them, gagged them, stripped them of movement and choice. He tortured, sometimes for hours. Strangulation was his signature, slow, deliberate, intimate. But he did not always stop there. He mutilated, he dismembered, he burned bodies, erasing faces, removing hands and heads, leaving only torsos behind. This duality defined him. By day, he was a husband, a father, a computer operator who typed behind a desk. By night, he was a sadist, a killer, a man who transformed hotels and apartments into chambers of death. And for years, he moved unseen. His crimes stretched across New York and New Jersey. The newspapers carried headlines of bodies discovered in strange circumstances, but the dots were not yet connected. The mask held. It would take years and many lives before the mask slipped. And when it did, the world would know Richard Francis Cottingham, not as the suburban father, not as the computer operator, but as one of the most sadistic killers in American history, the man they called the Torso Killer. By the late 1970s, Times Square was a very different place than the family-friendly tourist hub it is today. The marquees still glowed, the taxis still swarmed, but beneath the neon, darkness thrived. Peep shows, brothels, and all-night movie houses lined the blocks. It was a city within a city, where anonymity was currency, and danger moved easily through the crowds. It was here, amid the noise and smoke, that Richard Cottingham chose to hunt. On December 2nd, 1979, the Seville Hotel stood on Madison Avenue and East 29th Street, a place where businessmen, drifters, and wanderers found cheap beds for the night. That morning, smoke began to seep from beneath the door of one of the rooms. The staff rushed to investigate. They found fire, they found chaos, and they found something far worse. Inside the room were two women. Their bodies lay on the bed, but they were no longer whole. Their heads had been removed, their hands severed. Their torsos alone remained, mutilated and burning in the flames Cottingham had set to erase their identities. The fire department arrived swiftly, dousing the blaze. But the horror was already complete. The stench of burning flesh hung in the air, mingling with the acrid smoke. Firefighters, hardened by years of experience, staggered back at the sight before them. The women were later identified as sex workers who had crossed Cottingham's path. Their names were Jane Doe in those early days, their identities obscured not only by the mutilation, but by the stigma of their work. It was not until much later that the world came to understand their stories. What mattered in that moment was the spectacle of violence. Two women, decapitated, their bodies left to burn in a cheap Times Square hotel room. The newspapers exploded with the story. Headlines screamed of horror, of a sadistic killer stalking the city. Reporters called him the Torso Killer. The name stuck, seared into the city's memory like the smoke that lingered in the Seville's walls. The brutality shocked even hardened detectives. They had seen murder, yes. They had seen stabbings, shootings, the casualties of crime. But this was something different. This was deliberate mutilation, ritual in its precision, designed to strip the victims not only of life but of identity. Without heads, without hands, how could the women be named? How could their families know? Cottingham had tried to erase them. But he could not erase the terror. The killings at the Seville marked a turning point. For the first time, the Predator's private depravity had erupted into public view. New York was transfixed and terrified. Women working in Times Square whispered of a man with cold eyes, a man who seemed ordinary until the door closed behind him. Police, meanwhile, began to connect threads. Unsolved murders in New Jersey, missing women, cases with similar marks of strangulation, mutilation, fire. Cottingham had revealed his hand. The mask of normalcy still held at home, where his wife and children knew nothing of the carnage. But in Times Square, in the corridors of the Seville, the mask slipped. The world glimpsed the monster within. And yet, he was not done. The Seville murders were not his first, nor would they be his last. They were simply the loudest. Behind them lay a trail of women, tortured, bound, strangled, discarded, their stories hidden in police files and morgue drawers, and ahead, more still. The fire had burned out in room 417 of the Seville Hotel, but the man who set it would continue to burn through lives, leaving only ashes and silence behind him. Richard Francis Cottingham was not content with murder alone. Killing was not the end of his ritual. It was the vessel through which he lived out his darkest compulsions. At the core of Cottingham's crimes was control. He sought not simply to end life, but to dominate it, to hold it captive in every sense. His fascination with bondage began in his youth, a secret obsession nurtured through magazines, through images of restraint and power. As an adult, he brought these fantasies into the world of flesh and blood. His method was chillingly consistent. He lured women into his orbit, often sex workers, sometimes women he approached at bars or hotels. Once inside his room or his car, the trap closed. He carried handcuffs, ligatures, drugs. Victims would wake to find themselves bound, gagged, helpless. And then the suffering began. Some were beaten, some were slashed. Others were strangled, not quickly, but slowly. Cottingham prolonging the act, savoring the moment when breath gave way to silence. He took pleasure in the helplessness, in the fear that filled their eyes. For him, the kill was not about rage or impulse. It was about mastery. The brutality was not always fatal. Some women survived, broken, scarred, but alive to tell their stories. Their testimonies painted a picture of a man who seemed almost two-faced, polite and calm at first, then transformed into a sadist who fed on their terror. One woman recounted being drugged, handcuffed, and raped repeatedly, only to wake hours later, alone, in a strange hotel room, her wrist bruised, her body marked, her mind scarred forever. Another survivor described Cottingham's chilling calmness, how he spoke to her in an even tone while torturing her, as if cruelty were as ordinary to him as breathing. These survivors were rare. For many, there would be no escape. Cottingham's confirmed victims number in the dozens, though he himself has claimed more than 80. The names we know, Kerry Ann McCarthy, Mary Ann Carr, Valerie Street, Dide Gudazi and others, are only part of the story. Many were found strangled, some mutilated, some burned beyond recognition. Others vanished into the night, their fates never proven but suspected. His choice of mutilation was particularly chilling. By severing heads and hands, he stripped women, not only of life but of identity. It was an erasure, a final act of power. Without faces or fingerprints, how could the world know who they were? How could their families ever find them? This cruelty earned him the name the Torso Killer. And still, he returned home each day to his wife and children. He ate dinner. He watched television. He lived the life of a commuter, a family man, a suburban neighbor. His mask held firm, even as his inner world bled into the streets of New York. Detectives would later piece together the trail. Bodies left in hotel rooms, victims found in wooded areas, connections between New Jersey and Manhattan. But at the time, the crimes seemed scattered, disconnected, the work of different predators. Few could imagine that the same man who rode the PATH train to his computer job at Blue Cross Blue Shield was the same man who stalked the neon-lit streets at night, looking for women to bind and break. This duplicity was Cottingham's greatest weapon. He was ordinary enough to pass unnoticed, monstrous enough to terrorize a city. But by 1980, his cruelty would finally catch up with him, not through careful police work or forensic breakthroughs, but through the willpower of one woman who escaped his grasp. For years, Richard Cottingham moved unseen. He killed in hotel rooms, on dimly lit streets, in places where women were already invisible to society's gaze. His brutality made headlines, but his name remained absent. The torso killer was a shadow, a rumor, a monster without a face. That changed in the spring of 1980. On May 22nd, Cottingham abducted an 18-year-old woman named Leslie Ann Odell. She was a sex worker, vulnerable and alone when Cottingham approached her. He promised money, a place to go. She entered his car, perhaps believing she had found safety for the night. Instead, she found herself trapped. Cottingham drove her to a motel in Hasbrook Heights, New Jersey. There, behind a locked door, his ritual began. He handcuffed her, gagged her. He cut her clothes from her body and began his sadistic assault. But Leslie fought. Bound and gagged, she still found her voice, screaming through the walls. The motel staff heard. They called the police. And when officers forced their way into the room, they found a scene of horror frozen in motion. Cottingham looming over his victim, knives and handcuffs in reach, his ritual interrupted. The mask of the suburban father was gone. In its place stood the Predator. Cottingham was arrested on the spot. The news spread quickly. The man responsible for the mutilated torsos, the strangled women, the mutilated victims. He had a name, a face, a life that looked like anyone else's. The investigation that followed pulled threads until the entire web unraveled. Police connected him to murders across New Jersey and New York, the Seville hotel torsos, strangled women in Bergen County, burned bodies in Times Square. The evidence stacked high, the picture of his sadism undeniable. The trials began in the early 1980s. Courtrooms filled with the families of victims, reporters, and jurors who would hear details that still sear the mind decades later. In New Jersey, he was convicted for the murders of Mary Ann Carr, a 26-year-old who had vanished in 1972. Valerie Ann Street, a teen murdered in 1969, and several others. The testimony painted Cottingham as a man who led two lives, by day a father, by night a sadist. In New York, he faced charges for the Seville hotel murders. The jury was shown photographs of the charred, mutilated bodies. Detectives described the smell of burning flesh, the way Cottingham had tried to erase the women's identities by removing heads and hands. It was horror laid bare, and the jury could not look away. Time after time, the verdict was the same: guilty. Cottingham was sentenced to multiple life terms in both New Jersey and New York. In total, his sentences amounted to more than 170 years, a symbolic eternity, ensuring he would never again walk free. For his family, the revelations were shattering. His wife divorced him. His children grew up with the knowledge of who their father truly was. Neighbors who once waved to him from across the lawn struggled to reconcile the man who mowed his grass with the monster who tortured women in Times Square. For investigators, the trials brought closure to many cold cases, but they also opened new questions. Cottingham hinted, even then, that the murders he was convicted for were only part of the truth. In prison interviews, he spoke of dozens more. Women taken in the 1960s and 1970s. Bodies never found, names never spoken. The courtroom silenced the man, but it did not silence the story. And in the years to come, Richard Francis Cottingham would keep speaking. From behind prison bars, from hospital beds, from interviews where he confessed to even more. Each new admission, another shadow cast backward in time, into the lives of women long forgotten by the public, but never forgotten by those who loved them. The Predator had been unmasked, but his echoes would continue. San Quentin may hold the condemned, Sing Sing may hold the infamous, but Richard Francis Cottingham sits in New Jersey prisons, aging, frail, yet still breathing. A man who, half a century after his first kill, continues to speak of horrors not yet fully known. The 1980s locked him away, but the story did not end there. In interview after interview, Cottingham hinted at more. He claimed that the murders he was convicted for, the torsos, the strangled women, the mutilated bodies, were only the beginning. He suggested there were dozens more. Over time, his claims grew 30, 40, 50. By the 2000s, he was saying he had killed more than 80 women. In some moments, he boasted of nearly 100. At first, many dismissed these confessions as the ramblings of a killer seeking attention. But then, piece by piece, evidence began to match his words. In 2022, Cottingham was wheeled into a Nassau County courtroom. His body was frail, confined to a wheelchair. His voice was low, but his words carried the weight of decades. He admitted to killing Diane Cusick, a 23-year-old dance instructor murdered in 1968. For more than 50 years, her case had been unsolved, her family without answers. And now, at last, the torso killer himself spoke her name. He admitted, too, to 4 more murders of young women from the late 1960s and early 1970s. Their names returned to the record, their stories no longer consigned to silence. Families wept in the courtroom. Not for justice, for Cottingham was already imprisoned for life, but for closure. For the first time, they knew the truth of what had happened to their daughters, their sisters, their mothers. It was a chilling reminder that Cottingham's reign of terror stretched further back than most imagined, into the 1960s, into years when he was barely out of his teens. And it suggested that his boasts of dozens more victims might not be exaggeration. How many women fell to him? 20, 50, 100. The truth may never be fully known. The highways and hotels of New York and New Jersey swallowed the evidence long ago. The city has changed. The neon of Times Square scrubbed clean. The old hotels demolished or rebuilt. But the shadows remain. Today, Richard Cottingham is in his late 70s. He is confined to hospital beds more often than cells, his body failing even as his memory remains sharp. He still grants interviews. He still speaks of women unnamed. Each confession is a key turning in a long locked door, revealing rooms of horror the world did not know were there. And so the story does not end. For the families, each new admission is a wound and a salve. They learn the truth, but the truth hurts more than silence. They gain closure, but only by revisiting the cruelty of his hands. They sit in courtrooms, looking at the frail man in the wheelchair, knowing that decades ago, that same man bound their daughters, strangled them, cut them apart. Richard Francis Cottingham is not just a relic of the 1970s. He is a reminder that monsters can live long lives, that the past does not always stay buried. His voice, thin and rasping, still calls from prison. adding names to the roll of the dead. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all, that even now, long after the fires of the Seville hotel burned out, long after the neon lights of Times Square were scrubbed clean, the torso killer is still speaking, still confessing, still reaching out from behind bars to remind us that his story and the stories of his victims are not finished. The shadows he cast have not faded. They stretch on, into the present, into the lives of families still waiting for answers, and perhaps into the dark silence of cases we do not yet know are his. And so, we are left with a question that hangs heavy in the air. If Richard Cottingham has spoken of 80 murders, how many voices remain unheard?
Thanks for listening. This has been Fireside Crime Stories, where the darkest tales are always read by Firelight. If you haven't already, subscribe, and before you drift off, toss a little fuel on the fire. Hit that like button, ring that bell, so when the shadows shift again, you'll be the first to know that another fire's burning and another story's being told. Until next time, rest well.